One Stoic trick changed everything.
There was a morning not dramatic, not marked by thunder or sudden revelation, when I woke and felt the old weight still sitting on my chest. It had been there so long I no longer noticed it. Most days it simply belonged to breathing. That weight was the silent agreement I had made, year after year, to arrange my actions, my words, even the set of my shoulders, according to what I imagined others expected or approved. Not out of cowardice exactly, but out of a quieter habit. The belief that harmony required constant small surrenders of judgment to the crowd's invisible tribunal. You know this feeling, I suspect. You catch yourself adjusting a sentence before you speak it, softening an opinion that once felt solid, choosing silence when a truth was ready. It is not always fear of conflict. Often it is simpler, the desire to remain legible, to fit inside the frame others have already drawn around you. We tell ourselves this is maturity, consideration, social wisdom. Yet the body remembers differently. The jaw tightens without cause. Sleep arrives late and shallow. Small decisions carry an unnecessary gravity because each one is secretly being weighed by an audience that is never present. That morning I rose before light, as had become custom, and sat in the same chair by the window that looked onto stone and distant trees. The room was cold. I did not light the lamp. In the half-dark I began the familiar inventory. What had I said yesterday that I did not entirely mean? What gesture had I made to placate rather than to express? The list was neither long nor short. It was ordinary. That was what stung most, the ordinariness of it. No great betrayal, only the steady drip of concessions until the original shape of my own thoughts had eroded into something smoother, more acceptable. I remembered a passage from Epictetus that had once struck me as almost cruel in its clarity. If you are ever tempted to look for applause, pause and ask yourself whether you would still do the thing if no one were watching. At 20, I had read those words with the easy confidence of youth. They seemed mobile, distant, like a statue in a forum I admired, but did not yet need to enter. Now they returned not as philosophy but as accusation, because I had been performing for an empty theatre. The applause I sought was not even real. It was the imagined absence of disapproval. That is a thinner currency than most realize. You may ask why the change arrived so quietly that day and not earlier. I have asked myself the same. Perhaps because the previous evening I had watched a man I respected, older, weathered, speak plainly in a gathering where plainness was not welcome. He did not shout. He did not posture. He simply refused to bend the truth into a more comfortable shape. The room shifted uncomfortably. Some smiled tightly. Others looked away. Yet he remained undisturbed. His face carried no trace of apology or defiance. It carried only the calm of someone who had long ago settled the account with himself. Watching him, I felt something loosen inside me, not relief, but recognition. I had spent years avoiding that same discomfort, and the avoidance itself had become heavier than any disapproval ever could be. So I sat there in the grey light and made no vow. Vows are too theatrical. They invite the very audience I was trying to dismiss. Instead, I asked a narrower question. What would I do today if the opinion of others carried exactly the weight it deserved, or none at all? Not as rebellion, not as pride, simply as fact. The opinions of others are theirs. They arise from their own histories, fears, and blindness. They are not verdicts on my worth. They are weather, sometimes pleasant, sometimes biting. But weather does not dictate the architecture of a house unless the builder allows it. The first test came sooner than expected. Mid-morning, a message arrived from someone whose regard I had once courted. The tone was familiar. Indirect criticism wrapped in concern, the kind that invites defensive explanation or grateful deference. In the past, I would have answered carefully, clarifying, softening, preserving the bridge. This time I read the words, felt the old reflex stir, and then watched it pass like a cloud across the sun. I wrote a short reply, direct, courteous, final. No justification, no plea for understanding. I sent it and closed the device. The silence that followed was not empty. It was spacious. You will notice I do not call this liberation. Liberation suggests drama, a breaking of chains. There were no chance-only habits woven so finely I had mistaken them for skin. Habits can be unpicked slowly, thread by thread, without ceremony. That is what began that morning. Not a revolution, but a refusal to continue borrowing my sense of self from borrowed mirrors. Later, walking along the old stone path that borders the ruins, I thought of Marcus Aurelius writing late at night in camp, surrounded by men who served him yet understood little of his inner life. He did not write to impress them. He wrote to remind himself, You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. I had read that line countless times. Only now did I feel its weight shift from abstract principle to lived necessity. The outside events were never the opinions themselves, they were my decision to let those opinions rent space inside me. You may wonder whether this shift made me colder, more distant. It did not. Strangely, the opposite occurred. When I stopped measuring every word against imagined judgment, I became capable of greater kindness, not the performative kind, but the kind that arises when no debt is owed. I could listen without preparing my reply. I could disagree without needing to win. I could be present without performing presence. But the change was not complete that day, nor the next. It was only a beginning, a deliberate turning toward inner silence. And silence, properly understood, is not absence of sound. It is the space in which self-mastery becomes possible. The day I stopped caring what people think was not the day I became indifferent to them. It was the day I stopped needing them to ratify my existence. That distinction matters. Indifference hardens. Recognition of what properly belongs to you and what belongs to others clarifies. Clarity is not comfortable, but it is clean. And cleanliness of mind, Seneca reminds us, is the precondition of freedom. The path ahead was still long. Many old reflexes would return, whispering that safety lies in conformity. Each time they did, I would have to meet them not with force, but with patient observation, watching them arise, watching them fade. Discipline is not the suppression of impulse. It is the refusal to let impulse govern without scrutiny. That morning by the window was only the first quiet act of scrutiny. There would be many more. The morning passed into afternoon without fanfare. I walked the same path again, not because ritual demanded it, but because movement kept the mind from settling into old grooves too quickly. The stones underfoot were worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, mine, or only the latest. That thought brought no comfort, only a reminder. Time does not care for our resolutions. It simply continues, and we either align ourselves with something steadier than passing opinion, or we remain at the mercy of every breeze. You have felt this too, I imagine, the way a single decision to stop you. Seeking approval does not erase the architecture built around approval seeking. The structure remains. Rooms you once furnished with borrowed tastes, corridors lined with phrases polished for effect, windows positioned to catch admiring glances rather than honest light. Dismantling it is not dramatic, no wrecking ball, only the slow, deliberate removal of one unnecessary object at a time. In the early hours after that first reply, the silence I had created began to speak back, not in voices but in absence. No rush of messages demanding explanation. No flurry of concern masked as curiosity, just space. And in that space the old anxiety appeared not as enemy, but as familiar guest who had overstayed. It arrived in the form of questions I had never allowed myself to ask aloud. What if they think less of me now? What if this distance becomes permanent? What if I am wrong to value my own judgment above the collective? These are not noble doubts. They are ordinary human, and therefore dangerous precisely because they feel reasonable. The mind is ingenious at dressing fear in the language of prudence. I should explain myself, it suggests, to preserve the relationship. A brief clarification would cost nothing and gain everything. Yet clarification is rarely brief when its true purpose is reassurance. Each explanation invites another, until the original truth is buried beneath layers of accommodation. I stopped on the path where a single cypress stood apart from the other stalls slightly bent by wind, yet rooted deeply enough that no storm had yet uprooted it. I thought of Seneca's letters, written from exile, from illness, from the shadow of Nero's court. He did not write to win favor or to plead his case. He wrote what was true for him in that moment, knowing full well that truth would not always be welcomed. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality, he observed. How many of my own sufferings, I asked myself, had been rehearsals for disapproval that never arrived? How many hours spent scripting responses to criticisms that remained unspoken? The discipline required here is not the loud kind, the clenched jaw, the forced march through discomfort. It is quieter, almost invisible, the refusal to rehearse. To let the thought arise, they will misunderstand me, and then to let it pass without building a defense around it. Not suppression. Observation. When you observe a thought without feeding it attention or argument, it loses mass. It becomes thin air moving through an open room. That afternoon I returned to the same chair by the window. This time I brought nothing, no book, no device, no plan. I sat and allowed the mind to wander where it would. It wandered predictably toward the faces of those whose good opinion I had once tracked like a merchant tracks inventory. Each face carried its own ledger, debts of approval I believed I owed, credits I imagined I had earned. The ledger was imaginary, yet I had paid real emotional. Taxes on it for years. You carry such a ledger too, whether you acknowledge it or not. Every relationship, even the most casual, accumulates invisible entries. We tell ourselves we do this for harmony, for connection. But harmony purchased through constant self-editing is not harmony at his occupation. The self becomes tenant rather than owner. I began without ceremony to close accounts, not by confrontation that would only invite new performances but by internal declaration. This debt no longer exists because it never truly existed outside my own accounting. The opinion is theirs to hold, the burden of carrying it is mine to release. Release is not forgiveness or indifference. It is recognition that the weight was never fastened to me by external hands. I had strapped it on myself, believing it necessary for belonging. Belonging is the deeper lure. We fear that if we cease to adjust ourselves to the expectations of others, we will be cast out not violently, but quietly, into irrelevance. Yet the fear of irrelevance is itself a form of relevance seeking. The man who no longer needs to matter to everyone discovers he still matters to those who see clearly, and to himself. That second belonging is the only one that cannot be revoked. Evening came. I ate alone simply. No music, no distraction. The silence was no longer empty, it had density. In it I could hear the small sounds I had once drowned out. The breath moving through the body, the faint creak of wood settling. The pulse steady but unhurried. These are not poetic observations, they are facts. When the mind is no longer occupied with managing its image, it becomes available to what is actually present. That presence revealed something unexpected. The people I had feared disappointing were not monolithic judges. They were as preoccupied with their own ledgers as I had been with mine. Their disapproval, when it came, was rarely about me, it was about the threat my change posed to their own carefully maintained arrangements. A man who stops performing reminds others that performance is optional. Few welcome such reminders, so the second day was not about triumph, it was about endurance. Endurance of the vacuum left when approval is no longer currency. Endurance of the reflex to fill that vacuum with explanation or apology. Endurance of the quiet knowledge that some relationships may thin or end, not because of cruelty, but because they were built on a shared fiction that no longer holds. You will meet this moment too if you persist, not as crisis but as clarification. The people who remain will do so because they value what is real in you, not what is convenient. The others will drift not as punishment, but as natural consequence. There is no need to mourn the drift. Mourning implies loss of something essential. What drifts was never essential. Night fell. I did not sleep easily. The mind, newly unemployed from its old task of image management, wandered restlessly. Yet restlessness is not failure, it is motion. And motion, when not directed outward for validation, turns inward toward structure. Structure is what discipline actually builds, not walls to keep others out, but framework to hold the self steady when no one is looking. That framework had been missing for a long time. Now the first beams were being laid, not in grand gestures but in small refusals. Refusal to explain what needed no explanation. Refusal to soften what required edge. Refusal to borrow identity from borrowed regard. The work was only beginning. Tomorrow would bring new temptation, subtler, more plausible. A casual comment that invited defense. A silence that begged to be filled. Each would test whether the decision of that first morning had been a passing mood or the start of a different orientation. I closed my eyes, not expecting peace, only willing to meet whatever arrived without borrowing trouble from tomorrow's audience. That willingness to meet the moment without rehearsal is the beginning of real self-mastery. The third day arrived without announcement, like any other. Dawn light filtered through the same window, colder now, carrying the first hint that winter was settling in for the long stay. I woke early again, not from discipline so much as from the restlessness that follows when the mind has been given new boundaries but no new occupation. The silence I had cultivated was no longer novelty, it had become territory, and territory must be patrolled. You will reach this point. 2 if the refusal holds. The initial relief fades. What replaces it is not peace exactly, but a kind of nakedness. Without the constant labor of image management, the self stands exposed to its own scrutiny. No audience to perform for means no distraction from the performance that was always internal. The quiet negotiation between who you have been and who you might still become. That negotiation is rarely gentle. I walked farther that morning, past the familiar ruins, toward the open ground where the land falls away into dry valleys. The path narrowed. Fewer people came this way. The wind moved through sparse grass with a low, steady sound that felt almost deliberate. I let my thoughts follow it instead of directing them. They circled back, as thoughts do when given room, to the people whose opinions I had once collected like currency. Not all of them were distant acquaintances. Some were close family, old friends, colleagues whose respect had once felt like a measure of my own competence. The hardest ledger to close is the one tied to those whose good opinion once shaped your earliest sense of worth. A parent's quiet nod, a mentor's rare praise, a friend's unspoken assumption that you would always remain recognizable to them. When you stop adjusting to preserve those nods, those assumptions fracture, not because you have changed into someone unrecognizable, but because you have stopped changing to fit their version of you. The fracture is mutual. They feel the shift as loss, you feel it as necessary severance. I stopped at the edge of the drop and looked down. The valley below was empty of human trace, no roads, no structures, only stone and scrub in the slow work of erosion. There is a temptation here, one Seneca knew well, to romanticize isolation as purity. He warned against it. Solitude can become another performance, the performance of the detached sage, the man above petty concerns. That too is borrowing identity, only from an ideal rather than from living people. True detachment is not theatrical. It is ordinary. It looks like continuing to meet obligations without needing them to affirm your value. A memory surfaced then, unbidden. Years earlier, in a different city, I had ended a long friendship not with anger, but with the same quiet refusal I was practicing now. The man had grown accustomed to my role, the reliable listener, the one who softened edges, who never pressed too hard when discomfort arose. When I began to speak plainly, without cushioning, the friendship contracted. He withdrew not in fury, but in disappointment that I was no longer supplying the version of myself he preferred. I mourned it briefly. Then I saw the truth. The friendship had rested on my willingness to be edited. When I stopped consenting to the edits, the structure could not stand. You may fear this pattern repeating itself now. You should. Fear keeps the mind honest. But fear is not instruction. It is information. The information is simple, some bonds. You are conditional on your conformity. When the condition is removed, the bond either adapts or dissolves. Adaptation is rare. Dissolution is common. Neither is tragedy unless you have mistaken conditional attachment for something essential. I turned back along the path. The wind had shifted, now at my back, pushing rather than resisting. Small things, these meteorological details, but they teach what philosophy often states too abstractly. Resistance comes from opposition. When you cease to oppose the natural movement of events, including the natural movement of people away from a less accommodating version of you, you cease to suffer the friction. Not because the wind stops blowing, but because you stop standing against it. Midday brought the first real test since the initial message. Another arrived, this one from someone whose judgment I had once weighed heavily. The words were careful, probing, concern phrased as curiosity, an invitation to explain the change in tone, in distance. In the past, I would have met it halfway, offering reassurance, re-establishing the old equilibrium. Now I read it twice, felt the pull to repair what was not broken, and then set the message aside without reply. Not out of anger, out of recognition that explanation would only reopen the account I had closed. The discomfort that followed was sharp but brief. It felt like the ache of a muscle long held tense finally beginning to lengthen. The ache is not punishment, it is evidence of change. Change in you. The body is felt as soreness. Change in the mind is felt as unease. Both pass when met with patience rather than flight. Afternoon, I returned to the chair by the window. This time I brought paper and ink, not to write for others, but to record what was emerging when no audience was assumed. The sentences came slowly. They were not polished. They did not need to be. They were mine, unfiltered by anticipated reaction. That act, putting thought to page without regard for how it would land, was more liberating than any declaration of independence. Freedom is not the absence of constraint. It is the presence of self-ownership. You carry constraints you no longer see. Phrases you use because they once earned approval. Opinions soften because sharp ones once cost you regard. Silence is maintained because speech once invited correction. Each is a small chain. Removing them does not require grand gestures. It requires repeated quiet insistence. This belongs to me, this does not. Evening arrived with a slow rain. I stood at the door and watched it fall on stone and leaf. Rain does not ask permission. It falls where it falls. Opinions fall the same way on you, around you, past you. You suffer only when you run to shelter every drop, believing each one capable of damage. Most are not. The few that are hurt only if you let them penetrate unchallenged. That night sleep came more easily, though not deeply. Dreams carried fragments, faces turning away, voices fading, yet no panic, only observation. I woke once, noted the fragments, returned to rest. No need to interpret or defend against them. They were weather. The third day ended not with resolution, but with a clearer sense of what remained to be done. The old habits had not vanished, they had merely lost their automatic authority. Each time one arose the impulse to soften, to explain, to seek ratification, I met it with the same steady gaze I would use on a child testing boundaries. Not harsh, not indulgent, simply present. Presence is the discipline that underlies all others. To be present to yourself without needing to be presentable to others is the beginning of real identity, not the identity fashioned for consumption, but the one that endures when no one is consuming. Tomorrow would bring subtler trials. The mind is patient. It waits for fatigue, for loneliness, for moments when old comforts seem reasonable again. Discipline does not eliminate those moments. It equips you to meet them without surrender. I closed my eyes once more, listening to the rain on the roof. Steady, unhurried, like the work itself. The fourth day broke with fog so thick it swallowed the horizon. I could see no farther than the nearest columns of the ruin. Beyond that, everything dissolved into grey. There was something fitting in it, no grand vista to inspire, no clear path ahead, only the immediate ground underfoot and the necessity of placing one step after another without certainty of what lay beyond the next turn. You reach this stage when the first flush of resolve has worn thin and the mind, no longer occupied with managing impressions, begins to turn its scrutiny inward with greater insistence. What it finds is rarely flattering. Habits of self-editing do not vanish when you cease performing for others, they merely redirect. The audience becomes internal, a harsher judge, armed with every memory of past concession, every moment you once bent to fit. Now it asks not what will they think, but who are you really, when no one requires anything of you. I walked into the fog without a plan, letting the path decide direction until it narrowed to little more than a goat track along the slope. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet stone and pine. Each breath felt deliberate, as though the body itself were reminding me that presence is physical before it is philosophical. You cannot think your way into self-mastery while your shoulders remain hunched against imagined disapproval, your breath shallow from chronic vigilance. The discipline begins in the animal. Straighten the spine, draw air fully, stand where you stand without apology for occupying space. A recollection surfaced then, not from books, but from a morning years earlier, when I had stood before a mirror after a night of too much wine and too many careful words. The face looking back was familiar yet foreign, lines etched not by time alone, but by the repeated act of arranging expression to please. I had laughed at the absurdity then, but the laugh was hollow. That morning in the fog I did not laugh. I simply noted the continuity, the same face, older now, still carrying the faint imprint of those arrangements. The difference was that I no longer felt compelled to erase or justify the imprint. It was history. History is allowed to mark you without defining you. The path climbed. My legs burned quietly, a reminder that effort without audience feels different. There is no borrowed satisfaction in it, no imagined nod of approval to lighten the strain. The burn is yours alone, and therefore honest. You learn in these moments that discipline stripped of external reward is not punishment. It is clarification. What remains when no one watches is what was always there, the capacity for steady work, for bearing discomfort without narrative embellishment. Halfway up, I stopped at a flat stone that overlooked nothing but fog. I sat, no posture assumed for effect, no mental rehearsal of wisdom. Just sitting. The mind wandered to the people I had once needed to impress, not out of vanity, but out of a deeper insecurity, the fear that without their regard I would disappear not into nothingness, but into insignificance. Insignificance is the true terror for most of us. We would rather be disliked than unnoticed. Yet the man who ceases to court notice discovers something counterintuitive. Insignificance to the many grants significance to the few and to himself. The few who remain do not require performance. They accept plain speech, plain action, plain silence, and the self, relieved of the labor of constant translation, begins to speak its own language. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly like water finding its level after years of being channeled elsewhere. I thought of Marcus in his tent, writing at the edge of exhaustion, surrounded by men who saw him as emperor first, and man second if they saw the man at all. He did not write to be understood by them. He wrote to understand himself. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. The sentence had always struck me as austere. Now it felt merciful. No need to explain what goodness looks like to those who will never see it the same way. No need to defend the shape your life is taking. Simply be the shape, and let time reveal whether it holds. The fog began to thin as the sun rose higher. Shapes emerged. Distant ridges, the dark line of trees, the faint outline of the path descending again. With visibility came temptation, the temptation to interpret the clearing as reward, as proof that the decision had been right all along. I refused the interpretation. Reward is another form of audience. When you chase proof, you reintroduce the very dependence you sought to end. The fog lifts because the sun rises. Your clarity arrives because you persist, not because the universe applauds. Descending, I met the first person in hours, an old shepherd moving his flock slowly along the lower track. He nodded. Once, wordless, I returned the nod. No exchange of pleasantries. No need to explain my presence or my silence. The encounter lasted seconds and felt complete. That is what belonging without performance looks like. Brief, sufficient, unburdened. Afternoon found me back at the chair by the window. The light was sharper now, cutting across the stone floor in long angles. I took paper again. This time the sentences arrived with less hesitation. They were not profound. They did not need to be. They were accurate. Accuracy, when no one is grading it, becomes its own standard. You write what is true for you in that moment, knowing it may be revised tomorrow not to please, but to align more closely with what you actually see. You will notice, if you continue, that self-awareness sharpens most when approval is no longer the metric. Without the filter of how will this sound to others, thoughts reveal their own inconsistencies, their borrowed assumptions, their lingering fears. Each recognition is small, each correction is small. Together they accumulate into structure, not the brittle structure of performed virtue, but the quieter architecture of a mind that has stopped outsourcing its foundation. Evening brought wind sharp from the north. I closed the shutters against it but left one window cracked, letting the sound enter. Wind is indifferent. It moves without regard for who hears it. There is instruction in that indifference. You do not need to make yourself heard to exist. You do not need to make yourself understood to be valid. Existence and validity are internal facts, not social negotiations. That night the restlessness returned, but softer. The mind no longer raced to fill silence with justification. It rested in the knowledge that justification was optional, not forbidden. There would still be moments when explanation served clarity rather than reassurance. The discipline lay in distinguishing between the two. I slept more deeply than the previous nights, not dreamless. Dreams came fragments of old conversations, faces half turned away but they carried no charge. They were memory, not prophecy. I woke once, listened to the wind, and returned to sleep without needing to resolve anything. The fourth day closed not with certainty, but with sufficiency. Sufficiency is what remains when the hunger for ratification fades. You are enough, not in some triumphant sense, but in the plain, unadorned sense that no further endorsement is required to continue. Tomorrow would test that sufficiency again. The mind is inventive. It will offer new forms of doubt, new invitations to borrow worth from outside. Each offer must be met with the same unhurried refusal. This is mine to decide, that is not. The wind continued through the dark, steady, unpersuaded. Like the work, the fifth day came without transition, as though time itself had grown tired of marking beginnings and endings. The fog of yesterday had lifted entirely, the sky was clear, almost painfully. So the kind of clarity that exposes every imperfection in the landscape and in the one looking at it. I rose at the usual hour, but the routine felt less like habit and more like choice. Each small act weighed now, not against approval or disapproval, but against its own quiet necessity. You arrive here if the thread holds not as a conqueror, but as someone who has simply stopped running from the mirror. The mirror no longer shows a face arranged for viewing, it shows what has always been there, marked by time, by choices made and unmade, by the slow accumulation of refusals. There is no triumph in the reflection. There is only recognition. This is the man who remains when the performance ends. and recognition properly met carries its own gravity. I walked the long path again, this time all the way to the high ridge where the land opens toward the distant plain. No wind, no sound but my own footsteps and the occasional stir of a bird lifting from scrub. At the crest I stopped and sat on the same flat stone as before. The view was wide now, valleys folding into one another, stone giving way to stone, nothing urgent, nothing demanding interpretation. I let the silence settle until it became the dominant fact. In that silence the last echoes of the old question returned, faint now, almost courteous. And if no one ever sees this version of you, if the plain speaking, the unsoftened edges, the refusal to explain lead only to distance, to fewer voices, to a life lived largely, the question was no longer accusation. It was inventory. I answered it without haste. Loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of self. When you live edited for others, you are never truly with them. You are with a projection they tolerate. When you cease the editing, you may walk through periods of solitude, but it is not the same solitude. It is inhabited. You are present to yourself in a way that no crowd could ever replicate. The voices that fade were never speaking to you, they were speaking to the version you once offered them. Their withdrawal is not rejection of the real, it is indifference to what they never truly met. I thought then of Seneca again, not the polished aphorist, but the man writing from Corsica, from illness, from the shadow of death. He did not complain of isolation. He used it. While we teach, we learn, he wrote. But the learning was inward. The teaching, if it reached anyone, was secondary. The primary audience was always the self, held to account in the quiet hours when no one else could witness the account. You will feel this shift most keenly in ordinary moments. A conversation where you speak what is true rather than what is welcome. A decision made without consulting the invisible committee. A silence maintained when explanation would be easier. Each instance is small. None announces itself as victory. Yet together they build the only identity that cannot be taken, the one forged in private, tested in private, accepted in private. The sun moved higher. Heat rose from the stone. I stayed. There was no need to move, no need to prove the staying. Proof is another audience. When you have stopped performing proof, you are free to simply be. Descending the ridge, I passed the shepherd again. This time he raised a hand in greeting, brief, unelaborated. I returned it. No words. The exchange felt sufficient, not because it carried meaning, but because it carried no requirement for more. Sufficiency is the mark of maturity, knowing when enough has been given, when enough has been received, when the transaction is complete without remainder. Afternoon returned me to the chair by the window. The light fell differently now, longer shadows, sharper contrasts. I took no paper this time. There was nothing left to record for reassurance. What needed saying had been said inwardly, repeatedly, until it no longer required language to hold its shape. You may ask whether this state is permanent. It is not. Nothing human is. The old reflexes will return on tired days, on days of doubt, on days when loneliness wears the face of reason. Each return is not failure, it is reminder. The discipline is not to prevent their arrival, but to meet them without hospitality. Watch them come. Watch them linger. Watch them leave when given no nourishment. They fade faster each time. Evening arrived cool and still. I stood at the open door, watching the sky darken from blue to indigo to black. Stars appeared one by one, indifferent to being seen. There is consolation in that indifference. The universe does not require your admiration to continue. You do not require the universe's admiration to continue. The symmetry is complete. That night I slept without interruption. No fragments of old conversations, no half-turned faces, only the steady rhythm of breath, the slow settling of bone and muscle, the mind finally at rest within its own borders. When morning came again, as it will, whether you meet it or not, will find the same choice waiting, to resume the old borrowing or to continue the refusal. The choice is never final. It is daily, hourly, moment by moment. Each time you choose the refusal, you strengthen the muscle of self-ownership. Each time you falter, you note the falter without self-reproach and return to the choice. This is not arrival. There is no arrival while breath continues. There is only the practice, quiet, persistent, unglamorous, of aligning the inner life with what is true rather than what is convenient. If you persist in this practice, not for reward, not for recognition, but because it is the only honest way to live with yourself, you will find something Seneca called the joy that is reserved for the wise. Not loud joy, not triumphant joy, The quiet joy of no longer being at war with your own nature. Keep the ledger closed, keep the mirror uncovered, keep the silence inhabited. And if the path ever feels long or solitary, remember that you are not walking it to be seen. You are walking it to see clearly. Continue. Built by Stoicism.